disown their parents. What was the final straw? Story 1. My sibling passed away, and in the days leading up to the funeral, my mother was so exquisitely awful that I stopped fantasizing about harming her and began fantasizing about my life in prison after her murder. At one point, I was standing behind her at the top of a flight of stairs as she monologued about how everything was my fault. I could have pushed, but instead, I promised myself that after I made it through the funeral, I'd never speak with her again. This year marks a decade since I last spoke with her, and my only regret is not cutting her out of my life early. At the time, every interaction with her felt like a battle, with her always blaming me for things that were out of my control. The day of the funeral was the last straw. She berated me in front of family and friends, making a somber day even more. I remember vividly how I kept a calm exterior while inside. I was boiling with rage and sadness. It took every ounce of willpower not to lash out. After the funeral, I made a firm decision to cut her out of my life completely. It wasn't easy. There were moments of doubt, especially when other family members tried, but with time, I realized how much lighter my life felt without her constant negativity. I focused on healing, on building a life that wasn't overshadowed by her harsh words and unfair accusations. Looking back, I see now that cutting ties was the healthiest thing I could have. It allowed me to grow, to find peace, and to live without the fear of being blamed for everything wrong in her world. It's a decision I stand by, even if it took a tragedy to get. Story 2. It was a long time coming. The straw that broke the camel's back was when my father berated me for not attending a family function despite me telling him I had an unskippable commitment at work. For years, he had taken out his anger on me, perhaps as a twisted way of dealing with my mother leaving. His constant abuse had left me scarred and resentful, but this time, I couldn't hold back. I lost it. I told him exactly what I thought of him, every bit of rage and frustration pouring out. It was a confrontation that had been building up for years. The look on his face was a mix of shock and anger, but I didn't care. I had finally spoken my truth. That day, I made a decision. I cut off all contact with him and the rest of the family who always took his side. It's been 15 years since I last spoke to any, and I've never looked back. The freedom and peace I found in severing those ties were liberating. In the years since, I've built a life that's entirely mine. I've surrounded myself with people who respect and support me. It hasn't been easy, but it's been worth it. Each day I grow a little stronger, a little more at peace, knowing that I've taken control of my destiny. Story 3. Looking back, the incident itself seems relatively small, but it was a clear sign that our relationship was always going to be about everyone, including myself, upending their lives so my father could do nothing at all. The final straw came when he asked me to attend an appointment that would have required a 5-hour bus ride each way, missing classes, missing work, and finding my own place to stay overnight. I couldn't stay at my parents' home unless I slept on the floor in a sleeping bag, which I didn't even own. All of this just so my father could play happy family in public once again. I didn't get on the bus. Instead, I went to class, had a bad day at work, and then slept in my own bed. I didn't initially intend for it to be a permanent break, but as my workday was falling apart, I realized I would still rather be dealing with that than pretending to be a part of it. That day marked a turn. Every day since has been better without him in my life. He had a way of making good days miserable and bad days hell. The constant demands, the emotional manipulation, the expectation that I would always bend to his will. All of it took a toll on me. Now I live my life on my own terms. I focus on my studies, my work, and my own well-being. There's a peace in knowing that I don't have to cater to his whims or sacrifice my own happiness for the sake of a false family. Each day, I feel more empowered, more in control of my own destiny, and that, more than anything, has made all the difference. Story 4. My mother was a career crack, and despite everything, I still tried to help. I traveled 15 hours by Greyhound bus back to Illinois to assist her with some unfinished roofing jobs. Once the work was done, she intentionally picked a fight with me at the bus station, didn't get me a return ticket, and ghosted me on $2,500. I was left with maybe $30 to my name at the time. As if that wasn't enough, she shut off my cell phone immediately after driving away, leaving me stranded and disconnected. I had to walk about 5 miles to a friend's house. Thankfully, he and a few other friends banded together and drove me back down to Alabama that very night. That experience was the final straw. I never spoke to her again. The betrayal stung, but it also opened my eyes to the reality of who she was. She had always put her addiction and selfish desires above everyone else, including me. Since then, I've worked hard to rebuild my life. I surrounded myself with people who genuinely care about me and have my best interests at heart. Cutting ties with her was difficult, but it was necessary for my own well-being and peace of mind. I've learned to focus on my future and leave the toxic past. Now, every day is a step forward, away from the chaos she brought into my life. And with each step, I feel more grounded, more in control, and more hopeful about what lies ahead. Story 5. After telling my parents I was getting divorced, their response was nothing short of devastating. They told me, 1, my ex would always be their son and that they loved him more than me, though they tried to backtrack and say they loved us both. 2, that no one else would ever love me, and I'd realize I was ruining my life when I passed away alone. 3, they only loved me because the Bible said they had to. And 4, they were writing me out of their will and leaving everything to my ex because this divorce proved I was intellectually unstable. They added that once I came to my senses and went back to him, the inheritance would be mine. Throughout my life, they were emotionally abusive, but I kept going back, making excuses for their behavior. My ex was abusive too, so it was easy to believe I deserved to be treated badly when everyone around me echoed that sentence. Their words cut deep, reinforcing all the negative things I'd been told for so long. But something inside me snapped. I realized I deserved to be happy, and I couldn't achieve that while maintaining a relationship. They would never change, and I couldn't keep allowing their toxicity to dictate my life. It took immense strength, but I walked away. I cut ties and started to rebuild my life, focusing on healing and surrounding myself with people who genuinely care about me. It wasn't easy, and there were many moments of doubt, but each step away from their influence brought me closer to peace and self. Now, I am learning to love myself and understand that I deserve to be treated with respect and kindness, freedom from their emotional manipulation, and I'm building a future where I am valued for who I am, not for the role they tried to force me into. They may never understand that, but I no longer let that. My journey to happiness, and for the first time, I feel hope. Story 6. When I was shopping for bridal gowns, I realized I was gravitating towards shapeless, full-coverage dresses. It wasn't because I liked them. It was because I didn't want my dad to act all creepy and handsy or make gross comments about my appearance. The thought of him walking me down the aisle made me nauseous. Then it hit me. Just don't invite him. And so I didn't. On my wedding day, my now husband and I walked down the aisle together. It was a beautiful, empowering moment, free from the dread I had felt thinking about my dad's presence. Since 2019, I haven't spoken to my dad, and my life has never been better. Cutting ties with him was one of the best decisions I ever made. His absence has brought a sense of peace and safety that I didn't know I was missing. The journey to that decision wasn't easy. Growing up, his inappropriate comments and behavior made me feel constantly on edge. Family gatherings were a source of anxiety rather than joy. The wedding planning process made me confront these feelings head-on, and I realized that I deserved to have a day free from discomfort and fear. Now I'm focused on building a life filled with positive relationships and genuine happiness. My husband has been incredibly supportive, and together we've created a safe, loving environment. My wedding day was just the beginning of a new chapter, where I prioritize my well-being and surround myself with people who respect and care. Life without my dad's toxic influence has allowed me to thrive. I no longer have to brace myself for his comments or actions. Every day, I feel more in control and more at peace. It was a difficult decision to make, but walking away from that negativity has made all the difference in my life. Story 7. I moved out when I was 16. Growing up, my life was a series of bizarre and hard. For instance, I wasn't allowed in the house unless someone was home, so I had to sit outside after school for 2-3 hours during the brutal Minnesota winters. Summers were even worse. Living 12 miles from the nearest town in a very rural area, my isolation was profound. I was only allowed to take 2 showers a week, each lasting just 2 minutes. I was only permitted to eat dinner because I could get free lunch at school. These weren't even the big or strangest things, just the daily struggles. For example, about once a week, my father made me pick up everything on the carpet: lint, bits of grass, dog hair, by hand. I wasn't allowed to use a vacuum. If he saw anything out of place, I wouldn't get to eat. I had one chance, and he would watch me comb over every room while he watched TV, looking for anything on the ground. This was also the only time I was allowed in the living room. When I was 20, I decided to try rebuilding a relationship with my mother. I went to stay with my parents for a few days. However, I wasn't allowed in the house while they were away. I had to stay in a shed and couldn't eat any of their food. Since they didn't tell me this beforehand, I didn't bring it. After a few days, I left and never talked to them. That was about 25 years ago, and I don't feel like I've missed out on anything of value. To add to this, I had a brother who wasn't subjected to any of this treatment. They bought him clothes, gave him money, and helped him get his first. The favoritism was blatant and targeted solely at. Reflecting on those years, I realize how much I endured and how much stronger I've. Walking away from that toxic environment was the best decision I could have. Now, I live my life free from their oppressive rules and unfair treatment, creating a life where I am valued and respected. Story 8. My dad was always a functional alcoholic, but when he hit retirement about 6 years ago, I knew it would be his downfall. With nothing better to do, his drinking escalated. I initially stopped calling him after 3 p.m. because talking to him became impossible. Gradually, this cutoff moved to noon, and eventually, I couldn't handle any contact at all. I have a half-sister that my dad doesn't acknowledge and hasn't had anything to do with for 40 years. She reconnected with our family through one of those DNA sites, but my dad didn't believe. He concocted a story that they needed to do a paternity test on a 45-year-old to properly set up his will. He was so drunk that he misread the results and called her, telling her he wasn't her father. This whole fiasco started because my cousins invited her to a family reunion to meet him. I confronted my dad, telling him he needed to get help and apologize. His response was that he didn't care if he ever talked. That was the breaking point. I cut off communication, and it's been about 2 years since we last spoke. It really sucks because I miss my dad, but I try to remember him as he was when I was the man who would take me fishing, who taught me how to ride a bike, who was my hero before alcohol took over his life. It's hard, but I know it's necessary for my own well-being. In these 2 years, I've found some peace and clarity. I focus on building my life away from the chaos of his addiction. I cherish the good memories and let go of the toxic present. It's a delicate balance, but it's what I need to do to protect myself. I hope one day he finds the strength to seek, but until then, I have to keep moving. Story 9. My father was an incestuous predator. I hadn't seen him since I was 5. Growing up, I always craved a fatherly relationship, so when I turned 19, I decided to meet. The main condition for us being in contact was total honesty. Naively, I thought our candid conversations were genuine, and not just more lies. A few weeks later, my 21-year-old sister called me in tears. He had made a lewd phone call to her. Furious, I called him and threatened to end him if he ever contacted any of us again. Shortly after, his wife called and tried to blame his behavior on being bipolar. While bipolar disorder is indeed awful, it doesn't make you incestuous. That moment was a harsh wake-up. The hope I had for a normal relationship with my father was shattered. His actions proved that he hadn't changed, and it was clear that maintaining any connection with him would only bring more pain. He passed away in 2010. In the years since, I've found peace in knowing that he can no longer hurt anyone. I've built a life where I am free from his shadow, focusing on relationships that are healthy and genuine. It wasn't easy to let go of the fantasy of having, but it was necessary for my own healing and well-being. Looking back, I realized that cutting him out of my life was the best decision. It allowed me to protect myself and my sister. Now, I live with the understanding that sometimes the best way to heal is to distance yourself from those who have caused you the most pain. Story 10. My mom was dying of cancer, and she had a restraining order against my father. Despite this, he found her and tried to marry her during the last 6 weeks of her life, when her metastatic brain tumor had left her mentally compromised. My brother and I, as medical power of attorney, blocked the marriage, but allowed him to see her in hospice as an act of good faith. One morning, I received a call from hospice telling us to come quickly because my mom was passing. We missed her last moments because my father decided to yell at my brother for half an hour over a locked bedroom door. When we arrived at hospice, it was too late. My father did not come with us to hospice. Instead, when we called to discuss his involvement in the funeral arrangements, he took off with her documents, cards. He then pretended to be her online for days, telling her family to contact him for the real story. I was 22 and my brother was 19 when all this happened. That day marked the final straw. I had held on to the hope that maybe in a few years, we could have some semblance of a relationship, where I might call him once every. But after his actions that day, I knew I couldn't have it. His behavior only escalated after that, but that day was the point of no return. It was clear that any relationship with him would only bring more pain and chaos. Cutting ties was the only way to protect myself and my brother from further emotional harm. Since then, I focused on healing and building a life free from his toxic influence. It's been challenging but necessary. I've surrounded myself with supportive people who genuinely care about me, and I found peace in knowing that I no longer have to deal with his destructive behavior. The memory of that day serves as a reminder of why I made the decision to walk away and why it was the right choice for my well-being. Story 11. My father physically and verbally abused my sister and me when we were kids. Eventually, we were taken away and placed into foster care. Finally, our mom was found, and we went to live with her. For a couple of years after, I wanted nothing to do with my father. But around 10 years old, after starting therapy, I decided to give him another chance and began talking to him. For the next 20 years, I did everything I could to have him be a part of my life. I was always the one calling, emailing, and sending messages. I arranged for us to see each other despite him moving around a lot due to his military. In all that time, he probably reached out to me first less than 5 times. If I didn't initiate contact, we could go months without communicating. What finally did it for me was becoming a mom. I would do anything to protect my children and could never imagine hurting. This realization made me reflect deeply on my relationship with my father. I forgave him for everything he did, but then I questioned if he had ever done anything to deserve that forgiveness. The answer was a resounding no. I wrote him a long message pouring out my feelings. His response was typical nonsense, showing no real understanding or remorse. That was the final straw. It's been 2 years since we last talked, and I wish I had cut ties sooner. Now I focus on my children and my own well-being. Cutting him out of my life has brought me peace and clarity. I no longer waste energy on someone who didn't value me or make any effort to be a part of my life. Being a parent has shown me what real love and commitment look like, and I choose to surround myself with those who truly care. Story 12. Nothing too dramatic happened. I messaged her and was ignored. After racking my brain for any perceived slight I might have committed that would require groveling, I just let it go. I told myself that if she needed anything or had an issue to discuss with, she could reach out. I never heard from her again. Later, I heard from a sibling that she missed the live stream of my wedding. She told everyone that I changed the time of my wedding just to spite her. It was laughed. I didn't engage or try to correct her version of events. It became clear that she preferred to create drama rather than address any issues direct. Since that moment, I've focused on my own happiness and well, surrounding myself with people who genuinely care and respect. Letting go of that relationship was surprisingly easy once I realized how much lighter my life felt without the unnecessary drama. I've built a life where I don't have to worry about someone twisting my actions into malicious intent. It's been freeing and peaceful, and I'm grateful for the clarity that came with stepping back. Sometimes the simplest decisions have the most profound impact. Letting go of that toxic connection allowed me to move forward with more positivity and less stress. Life is too short to chase after people who don't value you. I've chosen to invest my time and energy into relationships that bring joy and mutual respect. Story 13. When my grandmother passed away, it was a tough time for everyone. She had been the glue that held our family together. During the funeral preparations, I noticed my mother acting increasingly erratic and controlled. She had always been difficult, but grief seemed to amplify her worst tendency. One evening, we were at the funeral home, finalizing arrangements. My mother started yelling at the staff over the smallest details, blaming them for things that were out of their control. I tried to calm her down, but she turned her rage on, accusing me of siding against her and not caring about the breaking point came when she slapped me in front of everyone, yelling that I was ungrateful and a disappointment. That public humiliation was the last. After years of enduring her emotional and sometimes physical abuse, I decided I couldn't take it. I left the funeral home that night and didn't attend the funeral the next, and I haven't spoken to her since. It's been 3 years. The guilt of missing my grandmother's funeral but the relief of cutting ties with my mother was even. In these past years, I've built a life free from her toxic. I've surrounded myself with supportive friends and found peace, and it's a difficult journey. I finally feel like I'm living for myself and not under the constant shadow of her anger. I miss my grandmother, but I know she would want me to be happy. Walking away from my mother was the first step, and I have no regrets. Story 14. My mom had an affair behind my dad's back, which led to their divorce. I tried to be there for both of them, but my mom started pushing for me to live with her permanently, meet her new man, and essentially cut my dad off. I wasn't willing to do that, but I still tried to maintain a relationship. Not long after, I found out she was doing cocaine. I was 14 at the time, and while I tried to forgive that, things got worse. She started asking me for money I didn't have, and it became clear that she cared more about the child support check she'd receive if I took her side than about me. One weekend after coming home from my mom's, I walked in on my dad, drunk and sobbing, with a loaded gun on the table. Seeing how much the situation had torn him apart and realizing how little my mom cared was the breaking. I decided to cut my mom off right then and there. It's been almost 15 years since I've spoken to her, and I don't regret my decision. Since then, I've focused on supporting my dad and building a life free from the chaos my mom brought into it. The decision to cut ties was difficult, but necessary for my own well-being and sanity. I found peace in knowing I made the right choice for myself and for my dad. Life without my mom's toxic influence has been liberating. I've grown stronger and more resilient, and I've built a network of supportive friends and family who genuinely care about me. I learned early on that sometimes the best way to protect yourself is to walk away from those who only bring pain and turmoil into story. My parents got divorced when I was between 12 and 14 years old. During that tumultuous period, my dad suddenly became an evangelical Christian. Overnight, everything in his life started revolving around God and Jesus. This intense religious fervor continued until I turned 18. When he decided to move to the U.S. because America is doing the Lord's work. When he moved, he completely ghosted my sibling and me, his 2 teenage children. He started a new Christian family in the U.S. and left us behind without a second thought. He came to visit only once, and during that visit, it was clear that he had no intention of maintaining a relationship. Over the years, he never met his 3 grandchildren. His absence was a constant, painful reminder of how he chose his new life over his own children. When he passed away in 2022, It had been 17 years since I had last seen him. I did not go to his funeral because to me, he had been dead a long time. His physical departure in 2022 was just a formality. The man who had been my father had disappeared years ago when he chose his new religious path and family. In the years since he left, I've built a life for myself. His absence has taught me the importance of being present and committed to those. I've focused on being the kind of parent who is always there for my children, valuing every moment with. While the pain of his abandonment lingered, I found strength in creating a loving, supportive environment for my own. Story 16. My dad and I were already arguing via Messenger. He had demanded, "Answer me!" regarding a question about my mom that was none of his business. Long story short, during our argument, I brought up how he picked on me mercilessly when I was a teen. He forced me to hide my face whenever I watched TV with the family so he wouldn't have to see me twitch because I have Tourette's syndrome. His only response was that I do not have. That was one of the worst times of my life. Being forced to hide a part of myself was humiliating and painful, and his denial of my condition felt like a slap in the face. His dismissive response made me question why I should even bother keeping in contact, so now I don't. Cutting him off has brought me a sense of relief and freedom. I no longer have to deal with his ignorance and lack of empathy. Reflecting on that time, I realize how toxic and damaging his behavior was. I've decided to surround myself with people who accept and support me, people who understand my struggles and don't dismiss my experience. Life without his negativity has been so much better. I've learned to embrace my condition and live without shame or fear. Apologies for the run-on sentences, but writing this out has helped me reaffirm my decision to cut ties with him. It was the best thing I could have done for my mental and emotional. Story 17. I was in recovery for alcohol addiction, having reached 2 years of sobriety. My brother, still a drunk, was enabled by my mother. The final straw came when I asked her to celebrate my 2-year sobriety milestone. She suggested going to a brewery. When I asked if she had considered why I wouldn't want to go there, given that every item was alcohol-themed, she started crying. She claimed she never gets things right and didn't understand why I hated her so much. That was it for me. I told her she needed therapy and that we were no longer speaking. This behavior was part of a pattern. She would thoughtfully compose plans that would hurt me but make her look like a doting mother. It was always about her being the victim. When I was 14, she moved an adult addict into our home. This person stole from me and verbally assaulted me for years, but my mother continually chose him over me. Cutting ties with her was necessary for my mental health and continued sobriety. I couldn't keep letting her toxic behavior undermine my progress. Since then, I've focused on building a support system of people who genuinely care about my well-being and respect my journey. It's been tough, but stepping away from her manipulation has given me the space to heal and grow. I've learned to prioritize my needs and surround myself with positivity. Each day, I reaffirm my decision to maintain my boundaries, and my life has improved significantly because of it. Story 18. For years, my parents have been trying to get me to divorce my wife, whom I've been with for 15 years. My wife has borderline personality disorder, BPD, and is recovering from a very traumatic childhood. I understand this and support her, even on the tough days. Despite this, my parents think she's a psycho and not worth my time. They can't see past her condition and the challenges it brings, even though I'm happiest when I'm with her, and we both work hard on our relationship despite our personal flaws. My parents' attitude is simply, she's broken, dump her. They don't understand or respect the progress my wife has made over the years. Their constant criticism and lack of support reached a peak when they gave me an ultimatum. Her or us. That was it for me. I stopped talking. My wife's journey has been challenging, but I'm incredibly proud of how far she's worked tirelessly on her mental health and our relationship, and I've seen firsthand the strength and resilience she possesses. Choosing to cut off contact with my parents was difficult, but necessary. They couldn't accept my choice or respect my relation, and their negativity was toxic. Since then, my wife and I have continued to support each other, growing stronger. Cutting ties with my parents has allowed us to focus on our future without their constant interference. Our life together is far from perfect, but it's ours, and we're both committed to making it the best it can be. Choosing my wife over my parents was the right decision for me, and I have no regrets. Story 19. My father abandoned my mom and me when I was 2 and divorced her long distance when I was 6. When I turned 30, I found him and we began talking. He told me about a brother I had and made it seem like I was part of a family. During our phone conversations, he would always tell me stories about my brother. After about 6 months, I realized he had never actually let me meet or talk to my brother. I suspected he never even mentioned me. When I confronted him about it, he got mad and said my accusation was hurt. Eventually, he admitted it was true. My brother had grown into his early 20s without knowing I existed. My father had hidden his entire first marriage and kid from his second family their whole life. He got furious with me for calling him out on his lies, claiming it was the most venomous thing he ever experienced. Despite this, I eventually met my brother, and we developed a good relationship. However, My father never spoke to me again. When he passed away, I wasn't even named in the obituary. Instead, it highlighted how he spent his whole life helping kids, except his own. He was a lifelong educator, but he failed in the most fundamental aspect of being a parent. Despite the pain and the lies, I'm grateful to have found my brother. We've built a relationship on our own terms, free from the deception that tainted our father's life. Cutting ties with my father was difficult, but necessary for my own peace of mind. It allowed me to move forward and focus on the relationships that truly matter. In the end, I've learned that family isn't just about blood. It's about honesty, support, and mutual respect. My father might have failed me in many ways, but I've found strength in forging my own path and creating a support story. My mom was always very controlling and manipulative. Growing up, she dictated every aspect of my life, from what I wore to who I was friends with. Her emotional abuse left deep scars, but it wasn't until I became an adult that I truly understood the extent of her damage. The final straw came when I was planning my wedding. My fiancé and I wanted a small, intimate ceremony, but my mom insisted on a grand affair. She took over the planning, making decisions without consulting us and turning it into her event. When I finally stood up to her and told her we were sticking to our original plan, she exploded. She accused me of being ungrateful and selfish, claiming I was ruining her vision of a perfect wedding. The argument escalated, and she said things I could never forgive. She told me I was a disappointment and that I was making a huge mistake marrying my fiancé. Her words cut deep, and I realized I couldn't continue to let her control my life. After that fight, I made the painful decision to cut her out of my life. I informed her that she would not be invited to the wedding and that I needed space to heal. She tried to manipulate me into changing my mind, but I stood firm. On my wedding day, surrounded by people who genuinely cared about us, I felt a sense of peace and freedom I had never experienced. It's been several years since I last spoke to her. The absence of her toxic influence has allowed me to grow and build a life that is authentically mine. I found happiness and strength in my marriage, and I've surrounded myself with a supportive, chosen family. Letting go of my mom was one of the hardest decisions I've ever made, but it was also one of the best. I no longer live under the shadow of her control and manipulation. Instead, I embrace each day with gratitude for the peace and stability I've found. Story 21. Growing up as a Jehovah's Witness, I was subjected to constant abuse and manipulation. My parents coerced me into marrying a JW man just after I turned 17. That marriage turned out to be a nightmare. My husband was extremely abusive and eventually abandoned me and our children. Despite the trauma I endured, my parents refused to accept my choice to marry a good man outside of the religion. This man stepped up and became an amazing father to my kids, providing the love and stability they desperately. However, my parents couldn't see past their religious dogma and continued to reject my decision. Throughout my childhood, I experienced close relationship abuse, which my parents never reported. Instead, they made me feel responsible for the abuse. The weight of this responsibility and the trauma from my past led to the development of PTSD. Realizing that the only way to improve my mental health was to cut them out completely, I made the painful decision to sever all ties. It wasn't easy, but I knew I had to protect myself and my children from further harm. Since making that decision, my life has significantly improved. The absence of their toxic influence has allowed me to heal and focus on building a healthy, happy environment for my new husband and I have worked hard to create a loving home, free from the shadows of my cutting ties with my parents was a difficult but necessary step for my mental. It allowed me to break free from the cycle of abuse and manipulation that had dominated my life. Now I can look forward to a future filled with hope, love, and the support of a family that true. Story 22. The decision to cut ties with my father wasn't the result of one single, but rather an accumulation of chaos and disrespect. His behavior took a serious toll on my mental well-being, and I found myself constantly questioning why I was suffering through this. One day, it just hit me. I was done. I decided to end the relationship for my own sanity. Since then, I still ache for that father figure in my life. Not him, but the ideal father that I never had. I'm saddened by the fact that I never got the father I needed and that everyone deserves a soft place to land, someone who builds you up instead of tearing you down, someone who tells you every day that you are enough and that you deserve to be loved just as you. The longing for that ideal father figure still lingers, but I've learned to find strength within myself and from the supportive people around. It's been a journey of self-acceptance and healing, realizing that I am worthy of love and respect, even if I didn't receive it from my father. Walking away from the toxicity was necessary for my mental health, and while it's been challenging, it's also been incredibly freeing. I've created a life where I can thrive, surrounded by people who genuinely care about. Though I never got the father I deserved, I've found peace in knowing that I am enough just as I am. Story 27. I stopped speaking to my mom, my only living parent, when I found out she had been trying to prevent me from marrying my now wife. Not because she thought the marriage would be bad for me, but because my mom wasn't invited to the wedding. We eloped instead. After we announced our plans to get married with only the two required witnesses, very close friends, no family, my mom routinely called me with reasons why I shouldn't marry my fiancé. They were all insulting reasons, such as claiming my fiancé was a gold, had mental health problems, or was just using me to get permanent residency. I'm British. My wife is American. Each time, I argued against my mom, and when she realized I wouldn't change my mind, she would start crying and end the call. We got married, and it was perfect. We later had a wedding reception in the UK for our British friends and family, and another reception in the US for everyone there. At the UK reception, my mom turned up very late, making a noticeable entrance. She barely spoke to my wife or me, but didn't cause a scene. About a year into our marriage, I noticed that my mom and wife hadn't built a good relationship, unlike my brother and his wife, who had married in the same year. I decided to have a serious conversation with my mom to try and start fresh. During that conversation, my mom feigned complete ignorance of ever making those upsetting phone. She claimed she never could have made them and therefore had nothing to apologize for. She got upset at the mere suggestion, walked out, and then returned to tell me something bizarre. Her unhappy marriage to my dad, who had passed away about 10 years ago, was only bearable because she looked forward to seeing her sons get. It was a strange comment in an already odd conversation. I tried to explain again why we eloped, but nothing satisfied her. When COVID happened, there was no opportunity to improve the relationship between my wife and mom through meetup. Thinking through that crazy conversation some more, it eventually hit me. My mom didn't believe any of the reasons she gave for me not marrying my wife. She couldn't recall what she said because the actual reasons didn't matter. She just wanted me not to marry my wife so I might meet someone else who wanted a traditional wedding. Her desire to see her sons have traditional weddings was more important to her than my happiness. So I wrote a letter to my mom, telling her that until she apologized for trying to stop me from marrying my wife, I didn't want to have a relationship. That was several years ago, and my mom hasn't spoken to me since. I guess it's permanent. Story 23. I was venting to my mother about my ex, who was driving his girlfriend and my kids around while so drunk that my child had to tell the younger one to make sure his seatbelt because they were repeatedly veering into the oncoming. I was also upset that my ex had moved his girlfriend in after my kids had only met her once they altered my preteen's bedtime to 9 p.m. so they could have sex so loudly that my kids felt like they were putting on a show. Instead of understanding my concern, my mother had the nerve to say I sounded jealous. This was coming from the woman who knew my ex had been abusive to me and the kids during our marriage, and had become more abusive, angry, and unhinged since the divorce. About a week after she said that, my ex left a significant bruise on one of the kids, and I wound up with full custody. That incident made it clear that my mother's comment was not just insensitive, but entirely out of touch with the reality of the situation. I'm still pissed about her lack of support, and her inability to see the danger my kids and I were in was infuriating. Cutting ties with her was a necessary step for my mental well-being and for the safety and stability of my children. Now, with full custody, I've been able to provide a safer and more stable environment for my kids. While the road ahead is still challenging, we are free from the immediate threat and chaos my ex brought into our lives. The pain of my mother's betrayal still lingers, but I've learned to rely on a network of supportive friends and family who understand and respect our situation. Story 24. My mom walked out on my dad and me when I was 5. From the time she left, I longed for her love and affection. My dad was a stand-up guy, but not the emotionally nurturing type. My mom ended up marrying her affair partner, who was a complete jerk. He abandoned his own wife and kids for her and never wanted me around. For 20 years, she strung me along with tiny dribbles of attention, occasional short visits, and phone calls where she'd act sad that we weren't closer. After her husband passed away, the phone calls became more frequent. She'd say careless and extremely hurtful things or be drunk and crying about how she missed me. The calls were incredibly painful to sit through. Every time we hung up, I'd break down and cry for the relationship I wished we had and the need for a mom's love that never went away. A lot of bad things happened to me over the years, and I always knew it would have been easier to get through if I had a mom who cared and supported me, someone to listen to me and help me through. The tipping point came at my wedding. We had a small beach wedding, and my mom decided to show up and play Mother of the Bride, a title she was definitely. She insinuated herself into special gestures aimed at my stepmom, which really pissed me. After the wedding and honeymoon, I sent her a letter telling her I didn't want to talk. I listed a bunch of the awful things she'd done and the ways she'd let me down. I told her she had made me terrified to have kids of my own because I didn't know the first thing about being a good mom or if I'd abandon them like she did to me. I told her it was just too painful having. It's been over 20 years and I'm at peace with that decision. Cutting her out of my life allowed me to heal and find stability. I no longer have to endure the emotional roller coaster of her intermittent attention and the subsequent heart. Now I focus on the positive relationships and I'm building a life filled with genuine love and support. It wasn't the fact that my father sold me to his father for free rent. It wasn't the fact that he beat me and starved. It wasn't the fact that he never saved or cared. It wasn't when he'd do drugs and have me, a 5-year-old at the time, clean up after. It wasn't even when I didn't see him from age 6, had no communication, his choice, or never got a birthday card or anything while my brother, his son, did. It wasn't even when he was a perfect blood match for my little sister who had leukemia, and he refused to do a bone marrow transfusion for her, causing her to pass away at just 3.5 years old. No, it was when he saw me at age 20 with a decent job that he finally got his head out of his peach and tried to contact. What did he want, you ask? Money. He wanted money, likely to feed his massive drug addiction. I told him then and there that he was dead to me, that I didn't want him to contact, that I wouldn't care when he passed away, that he wasn't my father and had no right to my life. Since then, he's been harassing me, so I legally changed my name. He had picked out my old name anyway, which was also the name of a popular brand. He's not original at all. I don't want anything to do with this man, and if he shows up on my porch, I will defend myself, and I'll be smiling when it happens. Cutting him out of my life was necessary for my sanity and safety. I've worked hard to build a life away from his toxic influence, surrounding myself with people who genuinely care about me. Each day I move further away from the pain he caused, and I find strength in knowing that I've taken control of my own destiny. Story 26. My parents divorced when I was 8, and my dad got custody of my younger brother. My mom was supposed to have visitation rights, but she rarely showed up. She was more interested in partying and living her life than being a mom. When she did show up, she often brought her sketchy boyfriends around, and I always felt uneasy. Things hit a breaking point when I was 14. My mom had come to one of my soccer games, something she rarely did. After the game, she started making a scene in front of my friends and their parents, yelling about how I never appreciated her and how she was the best mom in the world. It was humiliating, and I knew I couldn't keep letting her disrupt my life. I stopped trying to reach out to her after. My dad was supportive and understanding, and he never forced me to see. The next few years were peaceful without her chaotic presence. I focused on school, sports, and building a stable life for myself. When I was 18, she tried to reconnect, claiming she had changed. She sent me a long letter apologizing for everything and asking for another chance. I decided to meet her for coffee, hoping maybe she had genuinely turned a corner. It quickly became clear that nothing had changed. She spent the whole time talking about herself, barely asking about my life. It was all about her struggles, her feelings, her needs. I walked away from that meeting realizing I couldn't let her back into my life. I told her I needed to focus on my future, and that I couldn't have her in it if she was going to be the same toxic person. She blew up at calling me ungrateful and selfish. That was the final straw. It's been 5 years since that day, and I have no regrets. My life is stable and happy. I've surrounded myself with people who truly care about me, and so cutting her out was one of the hardest decisions I ever made, but it was also one of the best. It allowed me to heal and grow into the person I am today. Story 27. After a suicide attempt, my mother forced me to go to my family and apologize for wasting everyone's time and causing unnecessary stress. Even though my friend begged me not to, I complied. Afterward, I visited another friend about possibly renting a room in her house. My mother somehow figured out what I was planning and texted me to never come back before I'd even walked around the corner. She then called my grandmother to tell her that she had finally thrown the bad person out. Thankfully, my grandmother was furious with her and invited me to stay. She arranged a peace talk between my mother and me, during which we agreed to meet for coffee in a few days to sort things out. My mother never showed up, and 2 days later, my clothes were delivered to my grandmother. It's been almost 4 years since that day, and I haven't spoken to her since. Living with my grandmother, I finally found the stability and support I desperately need. She provided a safe space where I could begin to heal and rebuild my life. The peace and understanding she offered were in stark contrast to the chaos and emotional abuse I had endured with my mother. Cutting ties with my mother was incredibly difficult, but it was necessary for my mental health and well-being. My grandmother's unwavering support helped me realize that I deserved to be treated with kindness and respect. Since then, I've focused on surrounding myself with people who genuinely care about me and contribute positively to my life. I've made significant strides in my recovery and personal growth. Each day, I move further away from the pain of my past and closer to a future filled with hope and happiness. While I still feel the sting of my mother's betrayal, I am grateful for the love and support I've found with my grandmother and friends. Story 28. It was a slow burn. When I was younger, my mother could be very charming and loving, with intermittent bursts of physical and emotional abuse. As I got older, that ratio flipped, and I started reading up on personality disorder. My wife and I came to realize that we'd both grown up with toxic narcissists as mothers, enabled by weak fathers who wanted to placate the crazy person and keep their own situation calm, even at the expense of their children. A few years after we married, my mother-in-law left hours of recorded messages on our answering service. She filled our mailbox with rants about hoping we would lose our business and that I would pass away. My wife went no contact with her parents, and her life began to improve significantly. It took another 20 years before we did the same with mine, but my mom went down the conservative rabbit hole, which had a multiplier effect on her. We parted ways for 9 years and reaped the benefits of a drama-free. Then a year before they passed away, I got a call saying they would become wards of the state unless I became their conservative. They had allowed a live-in caregiver to get overly involved in their affairs. I decided to suck it up and make sure they were well cared for and could remain in their home. By this time, unbeknownst to me, my mother had dementia and my father, an avid reader, had lost his eyesight. Surprisingly, taking care of them at the end was a great experience. My mom's narcissism disappeared with the dementia, and she became charming and funny as hell. My dad became loving and apologetic. I think he was surprised I'd step up to the plate after all that happened. Nevertheless, I have no regrets about going no contact with any. Whoever said blood is thicker than water is full of cow. Family is where some of the deepest hurt comes from. Taking care of my parents in their final days gave me a sense of closure. It allowed me to reconcile the pain of my past with the reality of who they became at the end. My mom, stripped of her narcissism by dementia, revealed a side of her I never knew. My dad's newfound humility and gratitude made the experience unexpectedly rewarding. In the end, I learned that family is not defined by blood, but by the love and respect we show each other. The decision to go no contact was necessary for my mental health and well-being, and I have no regrets.